a lot more companies need to adapt that mindset of knowing that everything can be a transferable skill if you give it the space to allow for people to kind of flourish into their tech roles.
You know, creativity and a desire and drive to learn is ultimately what will help you out.
Welcome to Women Talk Tech, the podcast for business professionals committed to advancing women in the tech sector.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Women Talk Tech. My name is Ella Bush.
And I'm Maddie Yule.
And welcome to the second edition of Producer's Corner. Although you are just hearing me and Maddie, we want to let you all know that we have a special guest in the room with us right now.
We do. There's a third voice here today, and that is the voice of my cat, who has just woken up from a nap and decided that he needs to be on the podcast right now. So if you hear him screaming and yelling, that's what's going on.
Yeah, the joys of working from home, I guess. Yes. So we're coming on the podcast today because we wanted to wrap up our We Are All in Tech series. And the way that we're doing that is we're going to talk about our roles as podcast producers and I suppose podcasters in general, and discuss how technology is integrated into that role, and discuss the ways that both of us kind of feel like we have unconventional tech roles. I don't know if that would be accurate for you, Maddie, but I definitely feel like we have. Yeah.
I think it's weird. I feel like I don't often think of myself as working in tech, even though like we produce a podcast called Women Talk Tech. So it's like, if there's any definition of a tech job, it's this. But there's a weird disconnect that exists in my brain where I think about the work that I do on a daily basis. And then I think about that being called like working in tech, and something about that just doesn't resonate. And we'll talk about, our paths to getting here and our backgrounds and stuff like that. But I think because a lot of my background really like resides in the arts, and I was not really a science kid, like that just wasn't ever a path that I thought that I would take. So to now be in like a STEM job, a tech job, something about that kind of just, there's a weird disconnect in my brain there. So I'm like, yeah, we work in tech, but something about it feels a little non-traditional, I would say.
Yeah, I would say that definitely resonates with me. I think also both of us, we listened to this series so closely since we produced it, and found that we resonated with a lot of the guests and a lot of what they had to say about how technology shows up in their jobs. But speaking of our jobs, Maddie, do you want to tell me a little bit about what podcast production is and what you do? I know our roles differ a little bit, but how is technology integrated into the world of podcasting?
Sure. So I would say like the divide of our jobs as co-producers is that I do a lot of the pre-production stuff, and then Elle kind of takes over when it comes to post-production. But we're both very involved in the brainstorming of kind of the concepts that we want to talk about on the podcast. And this year especially, we've really focused on having our episodes come out in series, which is basically that we'll have a concept of something that we're seeing people have conversations about in the space, things that we're talking about internally as a team, and have this idea to build out a full series where we invite people onto the podcast to also have those conversations alongside us. So at the beginning of this year, we were wrapping up a series from the winter called Emerging Tech, which was all about new and exciting advancements in the tech world and kind of the women that are like trailblazing within their own fields. We then moved on to the Opening Doors series, which was more about like the people side of things, I guess, than the tech side of things. It was about actionable steps that people and organizations and leaders can take to work towards achieving gender parity and to really like open doors and let people in and to create a seat at the table for everyone to be involved in different technology processes and decisions that are being made. This series obviously is We're All in Tech. So we've been talking about the non-traditional tech sector and the way that technology has transformed jobs that kind of preside outside of what we would understand as being like in the tech industry. And then overall, throughout all of this, we've been talking about ambition as like a major overarching theme for this year and this era, I guess, of Women Talk Tech. Is like, what does ambition mean in 2023? How do people of all genders approach ambition, and kind of what does the future of that look like? So one of the big parts of being a producer, and like I think my favorite part, is coming up with the concepts and really doing a lot of that brainstorming work, because there is something really inherently creative about that I really enjoy. And so Elle and I work on doing that stuff together. And then the next step is, identifying guests, reaching out, doing our outreach, doing our scheduling, and then obviously recording the podcast. And then it gets passed off to our sound engineer, Dan. So shout out to Dan, who edits our podcast for us. And obviously, like every step of the way, technology is, I would say, like inseparable from each of those steps of producing a podcast. I mean, quite literally, like podcasting would not exist if not for technology. So, of course, there's I
think there's tech in so many different parts of our role, whether that be something like, capturing data from our guests so that we can create, questions for them. And that's all done through just as simple as like a form. And, even emailing, which seems so kind of mundane now, but that's a big, all of our communication processes are done through tech. And then you're right, podcasting wouldn't exist without technology. We record in a podcast studio, and Maddie will sit in on the productions. Sometimes I sit in on the productions. We make sure everyone's sound is good. So I do think that in a lot of ways, I agree with you that tech is, inseparable from all of those spaces for sure.
Yeah, definitely. And then do you want to talk a little bit about then what happens next when you take over?
Yeah. So I joined Women Talk Tech a little bit into that second series that Maddie was mentioning, Opening Doors, and my role has kind of evolved a lot in the past 6-7 months. But mainly what I do a lot of the communication with the guests after the fact, making sure that they have access to all of our episode materials. I create the episode materials. So I write the show notes. I create the podcast covers, the social media follow-ups for the podcast. So I clip audio bits and video bits and turn them into social media content. And then I actually do the physical uploading, which I forget I do sometimes, but I'm the one who goes in to our uploading resource site program. I'm not sure what the correct word platform. That was the word I was looking for. I go into our uploading platform and I, put the edited audio that Dan has passed to me and make sure I give it a once over, make sure everything sounds good. And then it goes live. So everything that you see once the podcast goes live, kind of both mostly visually, and also the writing that goes along with it, that's done by me. That I kind of forgot I did all those things.
Yeah, I know. It kind of, I would agree with that. As I was like listing them all, I was like, wow. Yeah, we do all those things.
We do all those things.
That's awesome. What was your path like getting here? I feel like that's a question we always ask Women Talk Tech. Take us back to high school. What were you doing? Did you ever envision yourself doing the job that you're doing right now? Did you ever see tech as a possibility in general? Like what? Tell me about yourself.
Yeah, I mean, I loved listening to podcasts my whole life. I never really thought about the behind the scenes of it. I never thought that there was really someone doing that. I think tech has this way of making human intervention and labor a little bit invisible. So like, you put your earphones in and you listen to a podcast and you don't really think about all of the ways that podcast had to get to you. When I was in high school, I was really into the arts. I thought for a while that I was going to go into theater. I didn't end up doing that. I currently study communications and cultural theory. So I look at a lot of media in my degree, all forms of media, whether that's audio or visual. And sometime around February, I had done a few internships in graphic design and community management, but I was looking for a change. I was working in service, and I happened upon my role at Marketing Copilot, where I'm a community manager. And they also needed someone else to come and kind of help out with Women Talk Tech. I had no prior experience in podcast production. I had no prior experience in working in tech either, or at least what I thought was tech. And I kind of learned as I went. And no, I never pictured myself working in tech. First of all, I had no idea what it meant to work in tech. I think a lot of people struggle to synthesize what they do when they do work in technology. My father works in technology, and my whole life I had no idea what that meant. So, and I knew that I was very different from him in terms of like my career aspirations. So because of that, I think I had a really big disconnect. Both my brothers also work in tech. So it was very hard for me to conceptualize finding myself in that role because I felt so different from the people around me who were working in technology. But then I kind of realized that in some ways, everything is working in technology. Technology is a part of my life, both in my work, in my academic career, in my personal hobbies. I do photography, and photography is very tech-focused in a lot of ways as well. Even analog photography, I would say, you're working with tech. So I think once someone labeled what I do as working in tech is when I started to like conceptualize that being what I did. But what was your path? I know we had similar
really
but different.
To yours. Yeah, really, really similar. So I talked about this at the beginning, but I was always kind of more of an arts kid than a science kid. And I think that we fall into this trap a little bit when we're younger, where you can be one or the other. And we know that's not true, but when you're younger, that's, I think, sort of how you conceptualize that. So I was much more in the art stream of things. I was a dancer and I did visual art and all that kind of stuff. And then I went to university, and when I was in school, again, I had no real aspirations towards technology. But when I was in school, I got involved in a lot of different clubs, and my role in those clubs was always graphic designer, social media coordinator, like marketing director. And that sort of got me thinking like, oh, I really like doing this, and like I'm good at this. And it wasn't really like a skill that I thought, like, I guess arts and creativity wasn't a skill that I thought was actually transferable to something kind of techie, but it very much is when you look at it in the graphic design, and I would argue like even in the broader like marketing stance. And so that got me kind of excited about this prospect. And then in terms of podcasting, like that had never crossed my mind, but it's so fun and like so exciting. Yeah. And also like extremely, extremely creative. And I think, that really was the biggest surprise to me, was that working in tech and being really like involved in this job where there are elements of it that are for sure not the most creative, but overall, like I would say that I get to do at least one really highly creative thing a day working in tech, whether that's something for the podcast or something for Marketing Copilot or something for a client. Like it's a lot more creative. And I think that we also have a lot more liberties at our jobs than I think maybe other more junior level or like younger talent people would at larger corporations. Like we really do have, we're afforded and given a lot of freedom to really like spread our wings, especially creatively. So that's also a really exciting part of it too. But that really surprised me was the creativity of it all.
Yeah. And I think we heard a lot of people in this series like recognize that intersection. In our last episode with Vanessa, she was talking a lot about how creativity and tech coincide. And she was talking about how music is working in tech. And I really resonated with that, especially because, I guess the first time I dipped my toes in working in tech was I was a theater technician for a little bit. I worked in lighting tech and sound tech in theaters. And there was no way I would have ever said that that was working in tech, because to me, that was the arts, that was theater.
Right.
And
but
now,
it can be both.
But it can be both. And that
Right.
was something that I held them, just like you and just like a lot of people, I held creativity and technology as two very separate things. But honestly, you know, I would say this, and I think also a lot of our guests were touching upon this in this series, that if you're a creative person, if you're someone who doesn't see yourself fit into this classic like 9-to-5 role at perhaps a corporate company or these traditional jobs that people are often funneled into, if you're not someone who sees that path for yourself, technology is a great way to forge a new path.
Right.
And I think that's one of the things that I've learned working here. I finish up my undergrad very soon. I'm very, very close to being done. And
it's exciting.
It is exciting, but that traditional career path really scares me. And I think this role has been really beneficial in showing me that technology is such a valuable tool for creating new ideas and new roles for yourself, and quite literally constructing spaces that align with what you're passionate about, what you're good at, what you want to be good at and learn about. I think working in technology is a lot of learning.
For sure.
Like constantly teaching yourself new things.
And I think it was Annalisa who I feel like really touched on that, who was, I guess, we had on to talk about the intersection of like education and technology.
Yeah.
And she talked about like technology allows people who kind of don't see themselves in traditional roles or like what they had initially set out to create non-traditional spaces where they can redefine themselves. And that's like very like basically what you just said. And I think like the thing that really resonated with me from Annalisa's conversation with Marie was that like any educational or experiential learning or like knowledge that you have is valuable in the tech sector. Like I didn't go to school for marketing or technology or anything like that. I've been to school for global development studies and publishing. And I would say that I like adequately use things that I learned from my degree and just general like experiences that I learned from being in university and being involved in like club culture and things like that. Like every day in this job. So I don't think that there's like a prerequisite for being in tech. And I think that a lot more companies and organizations need to adapt that mindset of knowing that like everything can be a transferable skill if you give it the space to allow for people to kind of flourish into their tech roles.
Absolutely. I mean, I know Annalisa personally outside of the podcast, and that's why I brought her in, is because we've had so many conversations where I was like, I don't know what I want to do. And she's a big advocate for just innovation and, you know, using your resources to create spaces for yourself where you feel like you can thrive and do well, and kind of breaking rules and breaking boundaries that you feel like confine you. And I think that's a really beautiful thing about tech, is tech has also opened up spaces and doors for people who have typically, you know, not been able to exist in certain roles or have access to the education about certain roles. And I think Anna touched upon this with politics and tech especially. Where that tech has just opened up so many doors for people to really, you know, find a space for themselves and learn. I think technology is such a beautiful thing in a lot of ways because we have access to so much knowledge through it and so much connection with the people around us through it. And I think that's my favorite thing about this role, is I get to connect with people all the time by being a podcast producer. I don't know if that would be true for you as well, but I think.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I feel like I have we have such a great like network of people and like community of people who have been on the show, who have listened to the show, who like follow us on socials, who we've met at conferences and things like that, where, you know, we have a couple conferences and awards coming up this fall that we're going to be going to. And I'm like so excited because I know that there's just going to be like so many friendly faces at these events. And that is entirely, I think, just a product of what we do, of like connecting and storytelling and giving people a platform and a space to kind of tell their stories and to have a voice. And yeah, I would agree. I think that's a really exciting part of this job. And also I think the continuous learning too. I mean, learning from the people who are on the show, so that community aspect there too. But I think also, you know, before this, like neither of us had ever really had experience working on podcasts too much, or like had that even in the back of our minds. And now we like produce this show and we've just like learned how to do this. And I think that's really exciting.
And you know, I used to be really skeptical of technology, I think as well. I think I'm someone that loves being face to face with people. And unfortunately, like my entrance into the workforce was directly during the pandemic. So I lost a lot of that. But, you know, I think that tech is a really wonderful thing. But I also would like to say that just because, you know, I work in tech or tech is super integrated into my life doesn't mean that it's necessary in all of the spaces.
Like it needs to be everywhere.
Right. I don't think tech needs to be everywhere. And I think tech can be a really great way for, you know, creating that connection between two people or allowing two people to connect. But then at the end of the day, you know, you're still just two human beings talking to each other.
Yeah. And that was what Macy and Nick talked about in their episode, which was about connecting to us LGBTQIA+ athletes, collegiate level athletes, to like mental health resources. And, you know, both of them, but Macy in particular, was a really big advocate for keeping technology out of certain processes, specifically when we talk about like the mental health and the therapy space. Because the nature of what they do in their work is, yeah, for sure, you can have online therapy or like remote therapy, virtual things like that. But the nature of what they do in their work is working with athletes. So you can't really replace, you know, being able to be at a game or seeing them on the bench, seeing how they're interacting with their coaches, their teammates, their peers. And in that case, like technology in a lot of ways can't replicate that and also shouldn't. So I totally get what you're saying, where it's like technology is great and it can automate a lot of processes and it can get people aware that there are mental health services out there for them. But technology shouldn't necessarily be the mental health services, you know? And I think that I guess idea is transferable to a lot of different jobs and industries.
Yeah. And like I said, like I loved listening to podcasts. I still love listening to podcasts, but it rarely crossed my mind that there were so many humans behind the scenes doing this work. And I think especially in an age of artificial intelligence, like we forget that there are people behind these devices and people behind this technology. And I think that's also something that has been really both informative, but also really cool about this role, is that it's kind of in a lot of ways, like, you know, showed me what's behind the curtain when it comes to technology. And, you know, we are two people who work for a rather small tech company as well. So we get to, you know, really work closely with our team. And it's nice to like humanize the processes that we, I think, take for granted sometimes. I think, you know, why I never pictured myself in podcast production is because I didn't know it existed. Like, and if it did exist, I thought that it was like a very select few people who did it, which I don't think it's like a massive industry, to be fair. I don't think podcast production is this huge conglomerate industry, but I will say that it definitely just like, you know, grounded a lot of what I do in my own life, whether that be like, you know, you see something on social media and, you know, you forget that there's someone who's sitting at their computer making that graphic, right?
Yeah.
Writing that copy. And even with artificial intelligence integrated into those roles, like you still need a person to facilitate a lot of those things.
Yeah, exactly.
Which
and
is,
I feel like also the thing with not even knowing that like certain jobs were even an option because you just don't think about the human behind all of it. My like approach, and I don't know if this was similar to you, but I very much kind of grew up thinking that like you go to school and then you get a job in what you went to school for. And like that's the path that you follow. And as we've learned on this podcast, not just in the non-traditional tech series, but in like, I feel like almost every other podcast that we have done with people who are working in the tech industry, a lot of them are like, oh, I started off with a theater degree. Like
I was going to say Brenly,
in politics. Like
Brenly, who was on our Opening Doors series, started off in musical theater.
Which was, so it's even that I think even just further reiterates that point, and maybe that's like a larger thing that we need to just kind of break down. And I do think that, like I said before, like tech companies and organizations also have a role in that of not exclusively hiring or making opportunities only available to someone who went to school for communications or went to school for marketing or went to school for computer science or something like that. And just like really acknowledging, like, I guess like a more holistic approach to where knowledge can come from and how that can transfer to talent across multiple industries.
And as someone who is getting a communications degree, I would just like to say that that's a lot of the conversation we're having in my degree right now is to reimagine kind of what some of these processes look like and reimagine the unconventional, like how have people used technology and how do like we use technology, to automate processes and make processes better, but also connect with people, and also like how can technology be used to, make that career path or make that life path less linear. I think that so much of that conversation has been coming up specifically just like as someone who's in higher education right now, and someone who's in a degree that doesn't necessarily have like a clear ending, like a clear after the fact, of like, how can we take these raw skills almost and make them transferable? Right. Of course, there are some degrees where like practical knowledge is practically applied, but I'm in a more theoretical degree. And I think because of that, a lot of my professors have been having conversations with the seniors in our classes about, these skills are transferable here, or you have no idea where these skills may be transferable. And that's the wonderful and beautiful thing about this. And also that you don't need a degree. You don't need a degree to work in tech, or in a lot of spaces. There's a lot of spaces where, creativity and a desire and drive to learn is ultimately what will help you out. I think a lot of what has benefited me in this role is just my love of learning and wanting to know more. All the programs we use to do our work, I self-taught myself. I don't know if it's the same for you, but most of the programs that I use in work, whether that be in podcast production or in the marketing side of things, were almost completely self-taught or taught by someone else at the company.
Yeah. I mean, even, and this is so funny, this example, but so even Canva, which is like so funny because, you go to school for graphic design. So when I went to school for publishing, we took a big chunk of that program was design, and we're using Adobe programs. So like InDesign, Photoshop, Illustrator, that kind of thing. So I know how to use all those, but you don't get taught how to use Canva in your college level graphic design class.
No.
And Canva, like I have been using Canva since probably for like 5 years. I've been using Canva. And it is extremely user friendly. It's so easy to use. However, there is also like a learning aspect to it. And you can use a template that's available for you. You can use the really user-friendly things, or you can kind of like do your own thing. And that also is a skill that you have to learn, which is funny because even like extremely user-friendly tools, there's still like a skill level and a building upon your skills that happens.
Yeah, and this really makes me think about, again, what Vanessa was talking about last week, where a lot of people will be like, I'm bad at math, but like that doesn't exist. You know, you probably think you're bad at math because the way someone maybe taught you how to do math, or the way that like we are told math works or math is, like, doesn't like fit, you know,
or like who math is for.
Exactly. Also. And that applies to tech, as she said. And I really strongly believe that to be true, where, you know, I remember about like 3 or 4 months ago, we had a conversation about having one of us sit in on recordings more often, just to make sure that everything is good and right. And that came down to, how do I level people's audio? Like, how do I make sure that sound is good? And our sound engineer literally came into the studio and was like, this is what you got to know. And I never thought that I would be able to do that. Like, and it's, you know, and it's something that is, everything feels so much more kind of obtainable when you take down these barriers about like who tech is for, and who you have to be to work in tech. So I guess that kind of leads me to ask you, I guess, sort of a wrap-up question with all of this, which is, how has this series, both working on it and also now being a part of it, helped you to reimagine what it means to work in tech? And how does this help you reimagine your own role and perhaps roles that you may take on afterwards?
Yeah, well, I think the like genesis of this series came from wanting to reach out to people who don't work in tech and talking about how technology has transformed their industry. And this idea of like, oh, we're all in tech, even though that was the series title that we came up with and that we were kind of running with, I don't even think that I believed it myself. Not saying that I didn't believe that these people that we were having on the podcast, all these wonderful guests that we were just talking about, weren't in tech. I was like, oh, like we're all in tech, but like not me, because I don't feel qualified, or I don't feel that I had the educational background to be like confidently say like, yes, I am in tech. And even just over the course of having this conversation of, you know, talking about transferable skills and taking down those barriers of who works in tech, who works in what like sector of tech, who does what jobs, you know, who is like STEM subjects for, is there, you know, a persona of a person who belongs in tech, and really taking down all of that and being like, no, that like doesn't exist. That's something that we simply have made up. So, you know, I think at the beginning of the series, I was like, yeah, we do all work in tech, except I don't work in tech. And now I feel as though I'm like, we all work in tech and I am also a part of that we. So it was a real full circle moment. What about you?
Yeah, I mean, when I took this role, there kind of became a joke in my friend circles that I work in tech now. That kind of became the joke, because I think a lot of people were like, what? I don't think many people in my life, including myself, ever pictured me saying that phrase, ever pictured me saying I work in tech, because it's just it was so outside of like what I thought I could do, and what I thought I wanted to do, which has totally been reimagined now, both with time in this role, but also this series. I think one of the guests that I found so inspiring was Owen, who came on here and was like, tech is for everybody. It's for all ages. It's connecting people. It's bridging the gap. And he's so right. I was so inspired just like by his like sheer passion for making tech accessible to people, because I think I felt like one of those people who was excluded from the tech space for a really long time, because I felt too creative for it. Like I felt, and I felt unskilled for it. Like I just didn't feel like I had the tools that I needed. And I think this series has showed me that, you know, technology and the way that it can help transform spaces and perceptions of those spaces is a really wonderful and powerful thing. And I still probably couldn't synthesize what I do. I still probably couldn't, tell my neighbor I work in tech and that's what that means.
Yeah.
And I think that's the point. There's no one definition of working in tech. And I think moving forward, like I'm really going to take that with me just because I don't think everything has to be so binary. I don't think everything has to be you work in tech or you don't work in tech. Vanessa said, if technology is in some way integrated into your role, then go ahead and consider yourself as someone in tech.
Yeah.
And I think that's a wonderful thing. I don't think it needs to be gatekept. And I will say, I love podcasting. I love podcast production.
I love doing this. It's so fun. I love when we get to come. I love when we get to get our little microphones out and come on the pod.
Yeah, it's
and I
fun.
love it as much as I love like conceptualizing the big picture stuff and outreaching to guests and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah,
it's just all so fun.
It is so fun because, as someone who is really creative and someone who studies art, like my favorite thing about it is the way it connects people. And I think podcasting is a really great way to connect with people and tell meaningful stories.
Totally.
And bring a lot of joy to people. So I'm happy to be here. I'm happy to be working in tech.
To work in tech. Exactly.
So much. That's the takeaway from this series is that Maddie and I are happy to be working in tech.
Yes, exactly.
And I think I'm just even more excited to see how this idea of what working in tech means transforms over and over again. I think that's something that we're definitely going to sit with here at Women Talk Tech for a while is this tech needs a rebrand idea.
Love it.
But yeah.
Well, with that, I guess we're wrapping up, huh?
I guess we're wrapping up. Thank you.
Gosh. Well, that's a wrap on our We're All in Tech series. Then.
Yeah. Thank you so much for joining in with us. We had a blast producing it and listening to it, and we hope you did too.
Yay. Thank you. And also thank you to all of our guests who came on the show. It was such a good series, and it was like just more than I ever imagined that it could be. So thank you so much to everyone who had a hand in making it happen.
And thank you so much for listening. This has been Women Talk Tech.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.